You could chat amongst yourselves and know that if there are seats in the front that are empty, I'm going to be encouraging everybody to move forward, because I do every year. You know the game, right? Like, it is depressing for anyone to be staring at empty chairs, right? Think of your speakers. Come on, you can it's good exercise. Yes, I will not bite you, I promise. What is that? Yeah, at least the two of you, you know. Yes, yes. I mean, I could actually wish for more of such resistance in other realms of the world. Oh, thank you. Yay. Oh my. Can we just get this out of the way? I'm not going to use it. We're going to put this. We all know how much I love a podium, that I stand right behind it and never move. Oh my God.
Hi, friend.
I'm not going to cry. I'm not. I'm going to cry. Can we fix that, please?
Oh, yes.
Let's fix that. Let me just get through the end of the semester.
Yes.
Okay. God, it's good to see
Love you.
you. Love you too. Oh, and there's somebody else I know.
Sit here.
How are you? So good to see you again.
Oh,
You
gosh.
know, I've got some of your videos about Ruth on my YouTube if you ever want them.
Okay, I might. Oh my. I do. Which, frankly, if you could give me that instead of this. No, it's the plastic, right? Yeah, just let's avoid the plastic. They do walk in late. But what are they going to miss? They're going to miss you saying, "Here's Barbara."
Here's Barbara.
It's so quiet, we have to start. Oh, good, you moved up front. Okay, thank you. Well, welcome.
Back again.
We are delighted to welcome Rabbi Barbara Theide back with us again this year. You are our highlight, and we look forward to this every May, so thank you. Rabbi Barbara is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at UNCC and will be with us for the next 3 Sundays. She will focus on the fact that we recreate biblical narratives generation after generation to tell new stories. In recent decades, for example, scholars and exegetes have asked whether women show up as warriors, whether homosexual love is found in its text, or even whether magic is part of its narratives. In this series, we will start with a theoretical question: is the Bible something that we perform? In our second session, we will focus on a relatively new area of scholarship, one which asks about God's relationship to animals. Our final session will take a close look at God's unusual relationship with the Hebrew Bible's mythical monsters, the Behemoth and the Leviathan. Thank you.
You're welcome. That is not at all, by the way, what John and I expected me to do this year. And the reason for that is I just completely forgot that I had a notation that I was going to be doing burlesque in Bible. We'll do that next year, maybe. I don't know, you know what. There's always stuff to do. But I did also think that maybe my mind gravitated here instead of to the burlesque for a couple of reasons. I really asked myself, why did that happen? Why did I forget that? And I decided that there actually was connective tissue between what I thought I should say and the world that we live in. My 4th book is a set of interviews with scholars of sexual violence in the Hebrew Bible. And one of the scholars, Caroline Blythe, said to me, there is always a world in front of the page. There is always a world in front of the page. And so as scholars, she said, we must always keep in mind, what is that world in front of the page? Honestly, my friends, there's a reason for us to take a look at how and why biblical texts are reinvented, even reperformed every generation. Yohanan ben Bagbag said, turn it and turn it and turn it again, for everything is contained therein. And by everything, I mean both the ugly and the awful and the transformative. And it is incumbent upon us to name all of those things, the ugly, the traumatizing, the painful, and the transformative, and the beautiful. Because we live in a world filled with all those things. And if biblical texts are going to mean anything to us and for us, we have to contend with all those things in its pages and ask ourselves, what must it mean and what must it say to us in this time that we live in now? So I'm going to start by talking to you about the premises that we so often hear, and particularly from Christian and Jewish settings that are not represented in this room right now. The text is a fixed thing. Oh, what a silly statement. If you know anything even about the history of this text, you should giggle in response to that. Because honestly, this text was literally not fixed in any way until at the very earliest, and even then only problematically so, in about the 9th and 10th century CE. There were extant versions, there still are extant versions that compete with each other, both in Christian tradition and in Jewish tradition. There are different wordings, there are different phrasings in these traditions. If you go to Kaifeng Jewish collections, you will find a wholly different set of books make up the canon for those Chinese Jews than the set of books that are making up the canon for European Jews. All right, which one's fixed? Which one's right? Which one's correct? And then we can get a layer more complication with the fact that once the Dead Sea Scroll collection was found, where even more confusing spaces are revealed, where we have two versions of Jeremiah, and now we have to figure out, is it this one, is it that one, which is the true one, which is the right one, which is the authoritative one. You see what I'm saying, right? I could spend all 3 sessions talking to you about the complicated history of these texts, which will trouble any idea that there is such a thing as a fixed text. And what is even more important is that for how many centuries? We've been reading this text mostly in translation, whether it's New Testament or Hebrew Bible. And translation is a whole different animal, as I have repeatedly said to you over the years, because how many times have I come in and said, well, the text says this, but your translation says that. Remember Jezebel from a year or so ago, right? Turns out, nothing like what you thought, right? All those lovely little, subheads in your Bibles, they're a thing. And they are designed to make you think a thing about the text. Okay, the text is uniform, I've already spoken to that. Or we can reconstruct the text's grammatical sense, historical development, and ancient historical context. Reconstructing the text's grammatical sense is a hilariously funny idea if you ever struggle with the Hebrew Bible. I'm not an expert in Greek, so I can't tell you about New Testament, though the 5th book I write is going to be co-authored with a scholar of the New Testament, so maybe I'll have more information for you next year. We cannot reconstruct the text's grammatical sense in many, many spaces. If you sit with my version of Bible, the translation will repeatedly have like little asterisks and notes, and at the bottom it will say, Hebrew is uncertain, period. One of the texts that we use all the time to, or certain people use all the time to say homosexuality is banned in the Hebrew Bible, is so confusing grammatically that you can make a ton of different readings out of that one sentence. And you have all seen me do this kind of thing with just Genesis 1:26. Let us make a human being. Remember the 5 different versions? 5 different possible translations. Hebrew Bible speaks, and our job is to listen. We're just here to hear it, right? People like John will get up and tell us, this is what it means. We're just here to listen. No, you are not. You are here to think. And John and others who are in that particular kind of position are here to encourage you to think and encourage you to ask questions and encourage you to have doubts and concerns and wondering reflection. That's what you're about. So, another binary that isn't. Boy, do I meet up with this all the time. Now, you all know that by training in my first career, I was trained as a historian of 20th century history. I was not a Bible scholar. I've had 2 academic careers. That's why it took me 35 years to get tenure. Which, by the way, I got last week, so there we go. Yeah, it's been, on one hand, it's taken me 2 years. On the other, it's taken me 35. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. So that first career was meant and intended to ground me in understanding what is the historical significance of the period I am looking at. What do I learn about the way people think at the time? And do I consistently understand that the past is not the present and the past has its own integrity, and I have to be able to separate my world from that world in order to understand that world, right? That's something I'm sure all of you would probably nod your head and say, yeah, that makes sense. Well, kinda, sorta, because contemporary significance, right? Especially for something like Bible, which lives in the hearts, the minds, and the cultures of this entire planet, practically speaking. It's everywhere, in film, in TV, in politicians' mouthings, we could go on and on. It's everywhere. This is a text that has made its way around the world. So an example of this problem, I recently published an article that took 2 years to get through the peer process. Why? And it was published in the Journal of Biblical Literature, flagship journal of my field. Why did it take 2 years? Because I argued that the terms rape and rape culture were essential terms in the study of Hebrew Bible. There are a lot of people who would say, no, you're using modern terms. Rape culture isn't even invented until the 1970s. How can you use that term for something of this dark, long time ago, 2,000 years past? I quoted one scholar as saying, there is no such thing as rape in Hebrew Bible because women had no opportunity to consent. If there's no consent, then how can there be rape? He's speaking from a purely logical, legal perspective, right? If a woman can't consent to the use of her body, then there can be no such thing as rape, right? Everybody following that? No, you are not. Thank you very much, because the absence of consent is actually a fundamental pillar of rape culture. A woman doesn't have the right to say whether she can be touched or not. She can be used, her body can be accessed sexually or not, right? So this is not a binary. There is no clear binary. Oh, this is how it was back then. Oh, this is how it is now, and never the twain will meet. There are through lines from this text because it is used. It's a living text because it's used all the time. There are through lines, and we have to remember them, consider them, and think about them. Okay, so test case 1. The warrior women of the Hebrew Bible. I promise you that in the time of Luther, that idea was not floating around. Quite the opposite, in fact. Any of you ever read Martin Luther on the story of Dinah in Genesis 34? Dinah, Leah's daughter, does anybody remember what happens to her? She goes out looking for friends, and Shechem, the prince of the local city, sees her, wants her, and rapes her. Again, she has no consent. She's a girl. She's described as a girl. A vulnerable girl who's alone, right? And then there's this whole thing about negotiating whether he should marry her, and then Jacob's sons, right, engineer this fascinating situation where they get every single man in a physical situation having circumcised themselves in order to effect this marriage so that then the sons can go in, wipe out, kill every last man, and take the women and children, right? A reverse rape, a mass rape. People forget that. They take everybody out, right? Forget that part of the story? And read it again. They take the booty, they take the children, and all the men are dead, right? What did Martin Luther say about this? Martin Luther wrote a long sermon about how girls should not go out because they were inviting what happened to them. Stay home in your four walls, and you should not go out at all, right? Now, obviously, going from there to warrior women took many centuries, and thankfully, the hard work of feminist scholars. What is a warrior for biblical authors? A warrior for biblical authors is male. In fact, the deity is the great warrior of all time. My third book on divine masculinity in the books of Samuel, which I hope will be out by February 26th, it spends a lot of time on the deity as warrior. What does the term warrior imply for us, though? Do we have a different idea, right, than the ancient world where warriors are men who kill well? David is a perfect example, kills about 140,000 people. That includes, by the way, men, women, and children. Did you forget that piece? Like he destroys whole little communities, right, pretending to fight the enemy for the Philistines. You can tell David's not my favorite character, can't you? They kill well, and they humiliate their enemies, often in ways that are sexually charged in Bible. What does the warrior imply for us? Well, we can think about that. What assumptions do we even bring, particularly regarding violence done by women? I want you to think about that last one for a moment. So our historical context, this is what warriors should be. Men, take courage and be men. Otherwise you'll be slaves, right? You have to fight. The warriors of Babylon have given up fighting. They remain in their strongholds. Their strength has failed. They have become women. How many of you have seen from the extreme Christian right the comment that when men sit in front of computers, they become women? How many of you saw that in the news? No, they mean it. They mean it. They're not joking, right? This is why we're supposed to bring back manufacturing, so men can go out and do good physical labor, like cut down trees. Never mind that trees are mostly cut by large machines that lift them up by the, Anyway, no, that's real. On an extreme Christian right world, there's a whole lot of talk about how men have become women in America because they're doing intellectual jobs. Kind of looks like Jeremiah, in a way. In that day, the Egyptians shall be like women, trembling and terrified, right? Because God will raise his hand against them. Here are some, I say contemporary, some of these date back to the 1980s and 90s, but for us, that's still contemporary, and it certainly was for me. I was in my 20s back then in the 1980s, and these scholars, Gail Yee being one of the first, did so much work to rethink the women of the Hebrew Bible. Deborah can be presented as a commander and warrior. Yael can be celebrated as the ferocious assassin. Remember Yael, the one who drives a tent peg through Sisera's throat and mouth? Yes, John.
But also, especially one that, says, here, have some warm milk and lay down. So I agree, she's that ferocious woman warrior, but she's also really smart on it. She's not,
Well, and John, in my first book, in Malignant Fraternities, I actually argue that Devorah and Yael are really presented not as warriors, but as mothers. And their role as mothers is the primary role in Judges 4 and 5, and the giving the milk and covering him, and he's in this enclosed tent, right? I'll get to how I end up describing the violence piece, right? So I'm going to question all of this, even though I loved it when it first came out, because I was excited. Women in the Hebrew Bible are not just, right? I went through that. Did all of you? Like desperately, women in this room, were you looking for strong female characters in Bible? Yes, you were. I know some of you were, because we had been taught women are supposed to be quiet, at least in the New Testament, and subordinate and all that jazz. So we gratefully accepted a lot of what feminist scholarship was writing, and there's still value in it, right? What they were doing, of course, was creating a Bible, right, in their interpretation that was not to be found in Martin Luther's time. Okay, so central in the victory are women warriors, and here we go, Gail Yee, warrior queens. On the other hand, we have to ask ourselves some interesting questions. Women stalkers exhibit the same rates of violence as men. Arrests for violent crime and other assaults account in one study for 12.9% for women and 13, does this surprise you, right? Crime appears in general to be underreported for women. So, question, are we assuming that violence is a male thing? Are we assuming something here, and therefore are we attaching an exceptionality to what Yael and Devorah do that isn't as exceptional as we think? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, we got to ask that question, right? And I do that, actually, in that first book. I say, well, what about this? Does that trouble our reading of these women? Maybe women are almost as violent as men or just as violent as men, and if so, is this an exception that we're seeing, or is it not? How do we read it? Do we need to reread it and rethink again? And for that reason, by the way, let me go back for just a second. Whoopsie, I went way too far. For that reason, I end up saying, John, it might be that the violence that Yael does is not this warrior woman behavior. It might also be defensive behavior. A man has come into her tent. What do we usually expect in that situation? For her to be the victim of violence, right? And instead, she does all this motherly behavior, and then she takes care of him. And if you even want to complicate it further, do you feel like being presented with more complications? Okay. Yael means one of two things. You can either read that as meaning mountain goat, but it can also mean he went up from the Hebrew root for Allah. And Sisera, when he talks to Yael, says, stand by the door, and he uses a masculine pronoun. I'm going to go over some of this again later, just to complicate it, but let me give you kind of a trigger warning, not a trigger warning, what do they call that? When you give a teaser, yes, a teaser for what's actually going to happen. That'll complicate this story immensely. Another example here we have is one that I've talked to you about, so I'm not going to go into great detail again, but this whole question of can you even use a term like homosexuality and a conceptual framework that never existed in the ancient world? They have different ways of thinking about relationships between men. The word homosexuality is from the 19th century when psychologists were trying to describe what they considered deviant behavior in terms of sexual expression, and then came up with this term and a whole set of assumptions about what it meant, right? Like that there was this separable thing that had to do with men only preferring male bodies. I could go, if any of you are interested, there's a beautiful article written by David Halpern on 100 years of homosexuality. And he goes through various kinds of relationships that we find, male-male relationships, some sexualized, some not, some described as sexual friendships, some as non-sexual friendships, some having subordination roles to play that have to do with class. It's complicated, right? It's complicated. So, you know, can scholars use that term? Now, I would say you can use the term rape and rape culture about Hebrew Bible, but I would say you cannot use the word homosexuality about Hebrew Bible. That's because they really are not giving you the kind of evidence that they're thinking in the terms of 19th century psychologists. There are different kinds of relationships among men, yes. In one of them, Jonathan clearly adores and loves David. So, by the way, does Saul. Everybody loves David, by the way. The problem is that David doesn't love anybody himself, except God. But that's also a pretty weird relationship. So, how has such use been both liberating and destructive? Liberating because, as I say to my students, and you remember the year when I did a lot of gender stuff with you and we looked at gender stories that were complicated. I think I might already have spoken to you a little bit about Yael as a result of that. But liberating, I want the members of the LGBTQ plus community to walk into any context I'm in spiritually and know they have a home. And the story of Jonathan and David, while I do not agree that there is a mutual love between the two, does demonstrate one man certainly loving another in a way that is generous and extraordinary and deeply passionate. Do I have students who need to see that? Do I have congregants who need to see that? I do. Do I have students and congregants and other folks who need to see roles that are not in the binary world of gender, heterosexual male, heterosexual female, roles like Joseph, right, or Yael, or the others that we spoke about, I think a year or two ago? Yes, I do. So there's a liberating piece. There's also the destructive piece. Let's go to Leviticus. It says, you shall not sleep, a man shall not do this with another man, and then the interpretation of this very complex Hebrew is thinned out into a clobber text to destroy lives with. And I am serious, because people have died because of the interpretation of that text, right? So liberating and destructive. What does this application of modern terminology tell us about who we are and what we want to see? My friends, that is the most important question I can ask you from this slide. What is it that you want to see in this text? And what are you using to get it? So, Ken Stone, who, oh my goodness, one of my favorite scholars of all time. I don't know if any of you made it to the Witherspoon lecture. I was responsible for bringing him here to Charlotte last February. And he wrote, if scholarly reconstructions of biblical views about homosexuality are not simply the inevitable result of listening carefully to what the Bible says, but rather always proceed by more or less complicated interpretive maneuvers, then scholars and other readers cannot hide behind messages attributed to texts when making statements about homosexuality or other matters of contemporary concern. Instead, they will need to specify more clearly and take responsibility for the full range of considerations that led them to adopt this or that position in the contemporary debate. I would like to ask anybody in our world, when they say the Bible says to do just that, you tell me where you're coming from, and then I'll listen to what you have to say, right? This is why every one of my books includes all those aging, middle-class white woman, Jewish, with educated parents who went to college. People need to know that I had privilege, and they need to know where I come from. And increasingly, I am less and less silent about, yes, my last book says, yes, like so many other people in this world, I have known sexual violence, right? I have known it. I don't hide that anymore. Can't afford to. Bible is a doing. Living products always can reproduce and produce anew. The word said at a wedding to create a marriage, right? We used to say, who giveth this woman? Remember that? How many of the women in this room heard that at their own wedding? Raise your hands. You betcha. And that was based on property law. Property law both in Jewish and in Christian settings, that your father gave you as property to your future husband. Do we hear that anymore? Not so much. What we often hear is like ameliorative texts, right? Do you support the, right? There are like different phrasing. I know, I've used some of it myself when I'm officiating weddings. So things will change in order to code what is happening. Living products can produce anew. Templates are meaningful, signs can be reconfigured. This is why it is possible for me to use the signs rape and rape culture as signposts for what I'm reading in the text in a way that nobody would have done in the 1960s. Does this make sense to you? So we're recreating the text, we're recreating the ceremony, we are reinventing what we do in every generation. And here, I had slightly forgotten, and I apologize for this. I'm a little short of sleep. I had forgotten that I was going to give you a way to see how the signs are already being reconfigured in this text. Yud He Vav He will send Sisera into the hands of a woman. That's Deborah speaking. Sisera flees. And Yael's name, as I said earlier, is a he went up or mountain goat. And look at this text. He said to her, stand at the entrance of the tent. If anyone comes and asks you if there is anybody here, say no. Except that's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says, if any man, ish, if a man comes and asks you, is a man here, say no. And when Sisera says, stand at the tent, he speaks to Yael with that masculine second person pronoun. So he talks to her as if she's a man. I know. Curious, right? He says, you stand there, you man person, and if anybody asks if a man is here, say no. Is he effectively describing himself as a non-man? He's been behaving according to biblical texts like a woman. He ran away from battle. He is now lying helpless inside a womb-like structure, a tent. Do you see what I'm doing? Right? It's an interpretation. Of course it's an interpretation. But I'm reconstructing and revisiting and reconfiguring the text using the text. It's in the text. That's where he is. He's lying down. Lying down is a sign of submission. It's a sign of femininity. It's a reason why David in 2 Samuel 8 makes all the Moabites lie down in a row, and then he decides which ones will die and which ones will live. Remember that? He makes them lie down, because lying down is the female position. You can undo gender by using the appearance of unexpected gender citations to destabilize hegemonic forms of gender. I mean, you could do it. I just did. Who is Yael? Is she a warrior woman? Is she Is her gender questionable in terms of our expectations? She's not fitting the binary? Is she acting male because she might be more male? Do you see what I'm saying? How many of you have seen the film Conclave? Remember what happens at the end? Right? I don't want to tell the rest of you because it's so interesting, but I would suggest you see it, and you'll remember this talk. Okay? Another piece from Ken Stone. Bible is instituted through acts. Its appearance of substance, is actually a performative accomplishment, right? Which then the audience, including the actors, come to believe and perform. These acts by which Bible is accomplished are collective practices over time. In Martin Luther's time, Bible is performed in the mode of belief, and Dina is a bad girl who went out by herself and got what she deserved, right? But in our time, Dina is an innocent child who went looking for friends in a strange land and got assaulted. Something which actually seems pretty relevant for what we see in the world happening around us, where assaults of particularly children and immigrant children are a chronic problem. So, some bodies matter, some bodies don't. We've made a real set of decisions about that. At the moment, transgender bodies do not matter in this country, not according to the government that we have. I have 15 students in one of my classes. At least 2 of them are transgender, possibly 3. I don't think I need to tell you what that means. I don't think I need to tell you how frightened they are. When you have the Stonewall Jackson revolt, you all know what I'm talking about? When the LGBTQ community finally fought back against police in New York, right? We have a memorial at the location that this happened at. And the leaders of that revolt were 3 individuals, 2 of whom were certainly transgender women. Now, what's been happening? There's been a literal erasure of that narrative. There is literal uncarving of physical memorials. And there is a battle on to declare that there are just 2 kinds of individuals in this country. Cisgender heterosexual female and cisgender heterosexual male. If you're not paying attention to the way in which the LGBTQ plus community and the immigrant community is under assault right now, I suggest you think back to the 1930s, because the first victims of that world, of the Nazi regime, were members of the LGBTQ plus community, yes, political activists, and disabled peoples. They were not first Jews. The first human beings who were gassed were members of the disability community, not Jews. We need to think about this, because what Bible is doing right now, and who is wielding it, and for what reason, and for what purposes, is a burning issue. Which translations will matter? The ones that say homosexuality is an abomination and a sin? And the ones that say Hebrew is uncertain around the same text? Which interpretations will matter? Which categories will matter? Sometimes, as you just saw me do, old-fashioned textual criticism could be really good for queering texts. That text on Yael gives it to me, hands it to me, and says, you can do this. because the pronouns are a bit goofy. Things are a little interesting and different if you are looking and intending to see a binary world. And if you're not, then those pronouns aren't goofy, they're intentional, and something's going on. Are there boundaries around what we can say and how we can perform biblical texts? I would argue yes. There are boundaries. You can't say anything. That is exactly why you cannot say that these Levitical texts are about homosexuality, because they are not. They really aren't. You have to twist yourself in about 5 trillion million knots to say homosexuality is banned in the Hebrew Bible. And those who are twisting themselves in those knots are frequently people who have never touched a Hebrew grammar, I promise you, or they would know better. Are we able to make the text mean anything? No, we cannot do that, and we should not do that. There must be some awareness that there are some boundaries around what we can do with these texts. Do speech acts, even textual ones, always exist in relationship to context? Should we assume with Butler a practice of improvisation within a sense of constraint? In other words, we get a lot of flexibility, but there are also some constraints on what we can do. So, in the interest of transparency as we go forward, though I think by now, if you don't know this about me, we're in trouble, right? Yeah, do I think that we mostly have male writers who subscribe to a good measure of what I would call toxic heteronormative assumptions in the Hebrew Bible? Absolutely, I do. And likewise, I also assume that those perspectives do not have to be reinscribed and reinforced. In other words, by naming them, I don't have to say that's okay, right? In fact, they need to be called out where I can call them out. They need to be transformed where I can transform them. Because reading the Hebrew Bible is actually a charge. My friends, it is a charge. It is an obligation. You are living in a world where if a woman goes to an immigration meeting, she and her 2-year-old child, who is a U.S. citizen, will be deported. If you care about the texts that are fundamental to who you are, then your responsibility is clear. Read them in a way that calls out what is toxic, what is wrong, and what is dangerous, and read them in a way that transforms the world, because people are suffering and people are dying, and these are matters of life and death. They always have been. They're just more obvious right now. So in the next 2 weeks, let's try for all those things. Let's try for playfulness. We're going to find some really playful, crazy making stuff going on with the Leviathan and the Behemoth. I promise you there will also be laughter, right? And we try to be kind, and we try to be generous. I think all those things are so essential to the project of studying together, and I know that I can rely on all of you for those things. How old is this relationship? We've been hanging out together for a long time. You all know what to expect to me, for me, which is going to be a certain amount of, fiery invocation, but you also know to expect from me love and compassion as a fundamental groundwork for the study that we do together. So, thank you. Time for questions.
I'm going to.
Don't be shy.
Okay.
Don't be shy.
I was startled from the beginning to the end, pretty much every minute or two, by the parallels to the originalism Constitution interpretation arguments. They're absolutely in parallel
Yes.
with minor deviations,
Yes.
even historical timing in some cases.
I can only just say yes. Did all of you go, oh my gosh, yes? Yeah, that is absolutely correct. How the Supreme Court is going to read all of the questions in front of us in light of that, I mean, that's their Bible, right?
I have a question.
Okay.
I'll sit down. You talked about boundaries and constraints on reading Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what those boundaries and constraints are for
Yes.
the Hebrew Bible?
I absolutely can. I often say to my students, show it to me from the text. I need to see what you're saying happening in the text. The text has some rules. It's multivalent, yes. It is confusing in many spaces, yes. It's grammatically not so easy, yes. There are words we don't really know the meaning of, yes. And there are some boundaries in the actual words of the text. So let me give you an example I often quote. So you will have heard this one before. But in the second Genesis story, when God says to Adam, don't eat the fruit of that tree or you're toast. The Hebrew is unusually really precise. In the moment that you eat, or you can say on the day that you eat, but in the moment is actually the more likely translation. You're dead. And the word mot is never, ever, ever used for anything other than physical death. It means your body is done. You are physically dead. Now, Jewish and Christian tradition has jumped through hoops in order to say, nope, that's not what God meant. God meant the death of the soul. Or, nope, that's not what God meant. God meant that Adam was going to die 900 years later. You know, they've gone to, and then they quote Psalms, a day in the life of God. A day in the life of God is 1,000 years to man, you know. Like the Psalms writer was writing about Genesis. You know, what? Right. No, I'm sorry. In this moment, God says, you eat, you're dead. And you're physically dead. That's the threat. Now, God doesn't follow through on it, right? And possibly, in my own interpretation, that's because Eve does something rather clever to forestall it. But you can't fix that problem text. It is a problem text because it implies either that God lied, because they don't die when they eat from the fruit, right? Or that God changed God's mind in some way. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's a problem text, and you can't fix it. There's boundaries around what you can do with this issue and what it means. And I would say in many places, the way that both Jewish and Christian exegetes have become so incredibly creative in order to, look, I've told you the story about how the rabbis got around the law of harem, right? Like you have to burn everything in an idolatrous city, right? I've not told you how they got around. Right, remember that one? You know, somewhere there's going to be a Jew in the city who has the Shema on their mezuzah. You're not allowed to destroy the name of God. That one takes precedence over destroy everything from idolaters, so therefore you can't destroy an idolatrous city. I mean, I'm sorry, the Bible basically says, take care of an idolatrous city, and this is how you do it. The rabbis are doing a complicated maneuver. Oh, but this law is more important than that law, right? And it's, you know, maybe the Supreme Court kind of games. But the text is the text. It's still there. And the danger of that text, instead of ameliorating it the way the rabbis did, this rabbi wants to call it out and say, that's wrong. That's a toxic text. when you are talking about destroying a city of idolaters, because it'll be used by somebody, and it certainly was and has been in history, to destroy people's lives because they were idolaters or they were an idolatrous city. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. Hope that answered Pam's question. Now the rest of you, don't be shy. Like, this is your chance to push me. Usually my husband, when he comes, does that, I know.
The only boundary that I heard was what the definition of the word in the text itself.
Yes.
And so I wonder, are there other boundaries? Like there are a bunch of them for the New Testament, and I can't remember them. Not that, but it was, is there a consistent pattern in interpretation throughout the Hebrew Scriptures? Or is it only the definition of that one word? Or would you look at the historical groundwork, framework in that time? What did it mean in that time? And then if you define what it means in that time, how do you then move it over to what does it mean in our time? How then do we make that jump?
Yeah, so that it's of that time is frequently, in my view, used as a way to sidestep what's upsetting, right? Oh, that's because it was a violent time back then. Oh, that was a different time, as if we are somehow less violent. What? What? We've gotten so good at violence, we can destroy the entire planet. We're doing it. Come on, give me a break. I don't even want to hear that piece. But it was this violent bad time, and we don't do, God is in the Hebrew Bible doing all these scary things because this is how people thought about God at that time, right? People think about God like that now. Every time there's a natural disaster, somebody will tell you that it's happening because people need to be punished. Where does that come from? That didn't invent itself. That comes from a biblical theology. So I would say part of my, even as a historian, and I also do this, Pam, there are times when I say to my students, no, you cannot retroject your ideas wholesale into the Hebrew Bible. You all know what, I'm going to possibly offend you, but I've done that before, so all right. I used to go into my Hebrew Bible class, and the first day I'd put 3 things on the board: Jesus, Satan, or devil, and hell. And then I'd say to them, get prepared, this will be upsetting. And then I'd draw a big X through all 3 of those things. None of those things are in Hebrew Bible. There is no devil in the Hebrew Bible. There is no hell in the Hebrew Bible. And there is no Jesus in the Hebrew Bible. Right? From the text, no. You can interpret things to mean A, B, and C, right? But from the perspective of those writers, they knew not Jesus, they knew not hell, and they knew not the devil. They really didn't. I promise. If you want me to spend some year doing Jesus with day 1 and Satan day 2 and hell day 3, we can do that. But I think you all know this already, so I don't think this is news to you. So, yeah, there are some constraints over what you can import. Yes, go ahead.
You have previously told us that the people writing the version of the Bible is critical, and that in many cases it's a male perspective.
Oh, probably in almost all cases.
In all cases, all right. And so how does that impact how we should now translate or read that male-dominant product?
Thank you. Consciously knowing that what is left of maybe female contribution may be caught in little sort of undercurrent stories, right, that are edited out. For example, the song that Miriam sings at the sea is reduced to 2 sentences, and Moses gets a whole, long poem. But the Dead Sea Scrolls has a poem of Miriam's song, and it was clearly a lot longer. You kind of wonder, right? If you read knowing that this is the product of, as Cheryl Exum says, an androgynous, that's not the word she uses, as the product of a male authorial voice, a communal, a set of male authorial voices, then you're likely to be a little bit more attuned to the problems that that's likely to create. And I think it helps you read more critically to think about this, right? And we should also do that with our exegetes. How many people have celebrated David as the great warrior and the consummate politician? He's even been described as the great CEO, right? I'm thinking, okay, Elon Musk and David propagating a lot of children. There might be some comparison here. And taking women for that purpose, right? However, so I think thinking about the text as that product does give you a certain, hermeneutics of suspicion at the start that is helpful to have, particularly if you are looking for ways to both call out the text, name what's toxic and dangerous, and see where the text can give you openings and doors, right, into another vision of the world. Because you have to do both all the time at the same time. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to take a leap of faith here. We know that in ancient times, through the Greek culture, Roman culture, there were incidents of homosexuality. I mean, male on male. Both, Alexander's father was killed by a jealous male lover, supposedly, in the Greek culture. Roman emperors at various times had relations with men. But in the Bible, were they discouraging male to male or a homosexual relationship? We use that word because they wanted
male sexual.
Right. Okay. Because they wanted to encourage growth of the population, therefore encouraging heterosexual relationship, having more children. So thus we go 3,000 years ahead to modern times when we have the conservative Christians now interpreting it the same way.
Yeah. So I would, first of all, again not use the word even homosexuality for Greek and Roman male relationships, because sometimes these relationships are not about, a complex of expectations around lives lived together and shared together, but sometimes they are related to class and rank concerns. Now, let's keep in mind that there is only apparently a single sexual act that might be prohibited, and that is anal penetration from one man to another man. And in the first Levitical texts, there is a reading of that first Levitical piece, right? This comes up in 2 chapters in 18 and 22. And in 18, there are multiple readings of this text that it's set in a set of texts around incest, and this may have more to do with incest than it has to do with sexuality per se. Again, it is also a single act. And another part of this complex problem is that anal rape is a tactic that is used throughout the ancient world and even up to our own time. Witness what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. Anal rape is as an act of violence, as an act of war, as an act of feminizing, subordinating, and humiliating another man. So possibly are they writing in that context, right? That a man shall not do this to another man from their, where is Pam, historical perspective, right? We don't have enough information to know for certain, but if you look at the books of Samuel, and if you wanted a really depressing read and read my third book, you'd get case after case after case after case of how men are sexually humiliating other men in acts of dominance, and the one who's really super good at it is the dude at the top, and that's God, right? And the sexual humiliation from one man to another man is part of these texts, and there are all sorts of metaphorical ways in which other men are castrated, other men are sexually humiliated, and other men are raped. So my sense is that I would read these texts as a question around that, because there's so much of that elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible that it suggests to me that there might be a rule that somebody is suggesting to try to bring the possibility of raping another man down a little bit, right? Because that would be an abomination in my view, right? But that's just where I would take it. I don't know if they're thinking about procreation, but yes, $5,000 for every baby you have. For those of you who are interested, mothers of the world are out there in America going, yo, $5,000 will go a good way towards taking care of my child care needs. I'm sure, but yeah, anyway.
We are out of time. It went fast. Thank you. Thank you for challenging us, for opening up our minds. Thank you, Barbara.
One quick announcement. Thank you. So next Sunday, we are sharing the congregation house with the new member class. They will move out of this place at 9:45, so we're going to hold everybody out on the porch and in this end of the hallway until 9:45. They're going to leave by that door. You're going to come in by this door, but the chairs are going to be in a big circle, so we're going to need your help to kind of get them into rows.
Why not leave it in a big circle? Why not? I hate teaching people in rows if I have
We will probably need, it's 60 people. No, as long as you stand kind of in the middle, we can keep it in a circle.
Keep it in a circle.
But we'll probably need to shrink the circle because it's 60.
Wouldn't you rather look at each other's faces than just mine all the time?
Oh, look, she's already pushing.
No, come on, look.
Circle's fine. We'll just need to make it a little bit
There
smaller.
are 70 faces of God. Look around the room right now. Look around the room. There's 70 faces of God. You are looking at the faces of God.
Amen.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Circle it is, but we're still going to hold you out in the hallway next week.